At 67 years old, I spent nearly $10,000 traveling through 4 Southeast Asian countries to answer one question. Where could I build a comfortable life on $2,275 a month? Cambodia was the cheapest. Vietnam gave me the best value. Thailand was the easiest place to imagine settling. And the country I eventually chose? It was the one I nearly crossed off after my first month. That was not how I expected this to go. I was not wealthy. I had Social Security, about $42,000 in savings, and enough set aside to handle an emergency without panicking. That gave me choices, but I still had to pay attention. I checked hotel prices. I compared flights. I stood in grocery aisles doing the math in my head. This was also not a vacation where I rushed through the highlights and went home 2 weeks later. I wanted to stay long enough in each country to buy groceries, do laundry, get lost, deal with the weather, and find out what an ordinary Tuesday felt like. My list was the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. I planned to spend about a month in each place, then use whatever time and money remained to return to the one that felt most promising. For the first 5 months, I gave myself a travel budget of $10,000. That had to cover my flight from the United States, regional flights, short-term apartments, food, transportation, insurance, activities, and the bills that continued following me from home. Before leaving, I had watched hundreds of retirement videos. Some made it sound as though I could live beautifully in Southeast Asia for $1,000 a month. Others insisted I needed 3 or 4 times that amount. I wanted to find out what the life I would actually enjoy cost. So I kept track of nearly everything: the apartments, the groceries, the transportation, the mistakes, and the little conveniences that seemed inexpensive until I added them together at the end of the month. I began this trip thinking the numbers would make the decision for me. By the time I had visited all 4 countries, I understood that the numbers could tell me what each place cost. They could not tell me where I would be happiest staying. That part of the decision was never on my spreadsheet. Before I share what each country cost, you should know how long I waited to do this. I had been talking about traveling since my daughter was young. I would do it after she grew up, after the house was paid down, after work became less demanding, after I had saved more money. There was always another condition that had to be met first. My marriage ended when I was 47. There was no dramatic betrayal or explosive final argument. We had simply become 2 people sharing bills, responsibilities, and a lot of history. After the divorce, I focused on stability. I worked in medical billing for nearly 30 years. It was dependable, and I was good at it. I knew what every weekday would look like before it began. For a long time, that predictability felt comforting. Eventually, it started feeling like my entire life. My daughter grew up, got married, and moved a few hours away. I was proud of the life she had created, but I was no longer needed in the same way. I had spent years being somebody's mother, somebody's wife, and the employee everyone could rely on. When those roles became smaller, I had to ask what I wanted for myself. At 66, I began looking seriously at retirement. I checked my estimated Social Security and calculated what rent, food, insurance, and medical care might cost. I could have survived in the United States on what I had, but the margin would have been uncomfortable. One large repair or unexpected medical expense could have changed everything. Working another few years would have been safer. Instead, I waited until 67, filed for my full retirement benefit, and began getting rid of things. I sold most of my furniture, gave several boxes to my daughter, and put what remained into a small storage unit. Between that, my American phone number, a mailing service, and a few subscriptions, I still had about $300 in monthly expenses before paying for anything overseas. That is something many retirement budgets leave out. Your American bills do not automatically disappear when your plane takes off. I booked a round-trip ticket with a return date several months away. I wanted a way home without having to make an expensive last-minute decision. I also bought travel insurance and kept my emergency savings separate from the money assigned to the trip. My daughter drove me to the airport. Before I walked inside, she hugged me and said, "Mom, you know you do not have to prove anything, right?" I told her I knew, but part of me did have something to prove. Not to my daughter, to the woman who had spent 20 years saying she would do this someday. The Philippines was my first stop, and the first few days were exactly what you would expect after a long flight. I was exhausted, overheated, and pretending I understood more than I did. I had booked a comfortable, furnished apartment for the month. Nothing luxurious, but it had air conditioning, a small kitchen, decent internet, and a washing machine. The rent was $820 because I booked short-term and wanted something easy for my first landing. That was my first lesson. Short-term travel and long-term living are not the same thing. Online, I kept seeing people talk about apartments for $400 or $500. Those prices existed, but they usually required a longer lease, local knowledge, or more flexibility than I had during my first week in the country. I spent the first several days learning basic routines: where to buy drinking water, which grocery store carried the things I recognized, how to use transportation without turning a 15-minute trip into a 2-hour adventure. I paid what I now call the confused newcomer tax more than once. I ordered food because I was too tired to cook. I took more private rides than I needed. I bought imported snacks because they looked familiar. None of those purchases ruined my budget, but together they added up. By the end of the first week, I had spent almost $400 beyond the apartment. That made me nervous. Then something shifted. I stopped treating every day like a vacation. I bought eggs, rice, fruit, vegetables, coffee, and enough food to make simple meals. I found a small laundry place nearby. I learned which rides should cost very little and which ones were worth paying extra for. More importantly, I started talking to people. English made that easier. I could ask questions without rehearsing every sentence in my head. I could joke with the woman at the front desk. I could explain what I needed at a pharmacy. I could have conversations that went beyond pointing at a menu. One afternoon, I sat outside during a heavy rainstorm because there was no point trying to go anywhere. A family nearby started talking to me. We ended up sharing snacks, discussing where I was from, and laughing about how badly I was handling the humidity. It was such a small moment, but it stayed with me. I had been in the country less than 2 weeks, and someone noticed when I did not come downstairs one morning. Someone asked whether I had eaten. Someone remembered my name. That kind of warmth is difficult to put into a budget. Still, the practical side was mixed. The heat took more out of me than I expected. Some days were noisy. Transportation was not always simple. I also spent more on little trips and activities because I wanted to see enough of the country to make the month meaningful. Here is what my first month cost. Apartment, $820. Food and groceries, $432. Transportation, $176. Activities and short trips, $264. Phone, laundry, household items, and other small expenses, $156. My continuing expenses in America, $305. The total came to $2,153, not including my original flight from the United States. That was close to my entire monthly income. I loved how welcome I felt, but when I left, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. Wonderful people, maybe too expensive for me long term. I would come back to that sentence later. Vietnam felt different from the moment I arrived. Everything seemed to move faster. The streets, the meals, the traffic, the rhythm of daily life. I rented a smaller apartment there for $610. It did not have as much space as the place in the Philippines, but it was clean, modern, and close to almost everything I needed. My food costs dropped almost immediately. I could get a filling local meal for a few dollars, and the fresh food was excellent. I still cooked breakfast most mornings, but I stopped feeling guilty about eating out because it was often cheaper than trying to recreate the same meal myself. The value was hard to ignore. A ride across town could cost less than what I used to spend on a cup of coffee in the United States. Laundry was inexpensive. My phone data barely made a dent in the budget. Even after several outings, I was spending less than I had during my first month. This was also the country where I felt most independent. I developed routines quickly: coffee in the morning, a long walk before the heat built up, groceries every few days, one new place each afternoon, then back home before I was too tired to enjoy it. But there were challenges. The traffic made me tense. Crossing a busy road felt like an exercise in trust that I was not emotionally prepared for. I know people get used to it. I watched older women step into traffic with complete confidence while I stood on the curb waiting for a personal invitation. Communication also required more effort. Translation apps helped, and most people were patient, but simple tasks could become tiring when I was already worn out. That might not matter much at 67 and healthy. I kept thinking about what it would feel like at 77. Could I explain a complicated medical problem? Could I manage paperwork? Would daily life still feel exciting, or would the energy eventually become exhausting? Those were not criticisms of the country. They were questions about me. By the third week, Vietnam was winning on my spreadsheet. My apartment was $610. Food and groceries came to $348. Transportation was $92. Activities, entrance fees, and 2 day trips totaled $171. Laundry, phone, and miscellaneous costs were $129. My American expenses were still $305. The total was $1,655. That left more than $600 from my monthly income. For the first time since retiring, I could picture living on Social Security without checking my bank balance every morning. I wrote in my notebook, "Best value so far, easy to afford. Not sure I could keep up forever." At that point, Vietnam was the front runner, and I assumed Thailand would be the only country capable of changing my mind. I was wrong. Cambodia would cost me less than anywhere else I visited. It would also be the place where I started questioning whether I wanted to keep traveling at all. Cambodia gave me the lowest monthly total of the entire trip. It also gave me the first moment when I wondered whether I had made a mistake by trying to do so much at once. My apartment cost $520. It was simple but comfortable enough. I had a kitchen, air conditioning, and a little balcony where I sat most mornings with coffee. Meals were inexpensive. Transportation cost very little. I could have lived there for less than I spent almost anywhere else. On paper, it looked like the answer. But by then, I had been moving for almost 3 months. That does not sound very long when you say it out loud. People travel for years. Some change countries every few weeks and love it. I discovered that I am not one of those people. I was tired of learning a new grocery store, tired of figuring out another washing machine, tired of checking out, checking in, packing chargers, weighing luggage, and searching for the nearest pharmacy. The constant decision-making started wearing me down. One evening, I came back to my apartment after a full day out and realized I had not spoken to anyone beyond ordering food and asking for directions. I called my daughter. She answered from her kitchen while making dinner. I could hear dishes, her husband talking in the background, and a television playing somewhere in the house. For the first time since leaving, I wanted to be in that noisy kitchen more than I wanted to be where I was. I did not want to move back to the United States. That was not the feeling. I wanted familiarity. There is a difference. A few days later, I had a minor stomach problem. Nothing serious, but enough to make me uncomfortable. I found medicine and recovered quickly, yet it forced me to think about what happens when travel stops being fun for 24 hours. When you are sick, you do not care how beautiful a temple is or how inexpensive lunch might be. You want to know where to go, how to explain what is wrong, and whether someone would notice if you needed help. That experience changed the questions I was asking. Instead of, where can I spend the least, I started asking, where could I create a routine? My Cambodia costs were excellent. Rent, $520. Food and groceries, $312. Transportation, $74. Activities and day trips, $138. Phone, laundry, medicine, and miscellaneous costs, $131. American expenses, $305. The total was $1,480, nearly $800 below my monthly Social Security. I should have been thrilled. Instead, I wrote, lowest cost, beautiful experience. I do not feel settled here. That note surprised me because it went against the entire reason I had started the trip. I was supposed to be finding the most affordable place. Somewhere along the way, affordability had become only one part of the decision. Thailand was the country I expected to choose before I ever left America. It seemed to offer a little of everything: comfortable apartments, good transportation, excellent food, modern hospitals, shopping, beaches, quiet areas, busy areas, and a large community of foreigners who had already figured out how to live there. After Cambodia, Thailand felt easy. My apartment cost $705 for the month. It had a proper workspace, a good kitchen, strong air conditioning, and a building with security. I could walk to restaurants, a grocery store, and a pharmacy. That convenience mattered more than I expected. I was no longer interested in proving how adventurous I could be. I wanted daily life to function. The first 2 weeks went smoothly. I met other retirees. I joined a small walking group. I found a cafe where the staff began recognizing my order. I could see why so many people settle there. My spending was also reasonable. I paid $705 for the apartment. Food and groceries came to $389. Transportation was $118. Activities and a couple of day trips totaled $182. Phone, laundry, household items, and other expenses came to $146. My American bills were $305. That brought the month to $1,845. It was not as cheap as Cambodia or Vietnam, but it felt easier than both. If I had chosen strictly based on cost and convenience together, Thailand would have won. For several days, I started looking at 6-month rentals. I watched videos about neighborhoods. I checked what longer leases cost and how much money I could save by staying in one place. I even made a sample monthly budget. Rent, $600. Utilities, $120. Food, $400. Transportation, $100. Insurance, phone, and personal expenses, $350. That would have put me around $1,570 before occasional travel. Very manageable on my income. So why did I hesitate? Nothing was wrong. That was the confusing part. I was comfortable. I felt safe. The numbers worked. I could imagine staying. But imagining a life somewhere and wanting that life are not exactly the same. I kept comparing every place to moments I had experienced in the Philippines. Not the apartment, not the transportation, not even the scenery, the people. I missed being able to have a spontaneous conversation without reaching for my phone. I missed the casual friendliness. I missed the feeling that somebody might invite me to sit down simply because I was standing nearby. Thailand made the most sense. The Philippines was the place I kept thinking about. At the end of 4 countries, I sat down with my laptop and added everything properly. This is the part I think would help anyone planning a similar trip, because I made a few mistakes that increased my costs. First, I booked almost every apartment before leaving the United States. That gave me peace of mind, but it also locked me into short-term prices. Second, I moved too quickly. Every flight created extra expenses: baggage fees, airport transportation, meals on travel days, and all the small purchases you make because your routine has disappeared. Third, I treated the first week in every country like a vacation. I ate out more, took more private transportation, and paid for activities before learning what I actually enjoyed. The country-by-country totals did not include every flight, so I added those separately. My international flight from the United States was $786. Regional flights, baggage, and airport transportation came to $642. Travel insurance for the full period was $915. I also spent $487 on things I had not planned well: adapters, replacement clothing, extra baggage, medicine, fees, and 1 hotel night after a schedule change. When I combined those costs with the 4 monthly budgets, I had spent $9,963. $37 under my $10,000 limit. That was almost suspiciously close. My savings were still healthy, and my monthly Social Security had continued arriving, but the exercise showed me something important. Traveling through Southeast Asia was not automatically cheap. Living in one place could be affordable. Constantly moving was a different lifestyle with a different price tag. I opened the notebook where I had written a sentence about each country. Philippines. Wonderful people. Maybe too expensive for me long term. Vietnam. Best value so far. Easy to afford. Not sure I could keep up forever. Cambodia. Lowest cost. Beautiful experience. I do not feel settled here. Thailand. Comfortable, practical, and probably the safest choice. Then I noticed something. Every note was about money, energy, or convenience. None of them answered the question I actually cared about. Where did I feel most like myself? I thought back to the Philippines. I remembered being included in conversations. I remembered people checking on me. I remembered how much easier it was to ask for help, understand a joke, or explain what I needed. And I finally admitted that my first month there had not been a fair test of long-term life. I had paid a premium for a furnished, short-term apartment. I had taken trips. I had eaten imported food. I had moved around like a tourist and then judged the country as though I had been living normally. So I changed my return flight. I booked another month in the Philippines. This time, I was not going back to sightsee. I was going back to test an ordinary life. My second arrival in the Philippines felt completely different from the first. I was still tired from travel, but I was no longer confused by every small task. I knew what kind of apartment I needed. I knew which expenses were worth paying for and which ones came from convenience or impatience. Instead of booking another expensive short-term rental online, I found a furnished place through local contacts and agreed to stay for 2 months while I decided what to do next. The rent was $610 a month, including basic furnishings. It was not as polished as my first apartment, but it had everything I needed. I also changed the way I spent. I cooked breakfast and most lunches. I bought local fruit and vegetables. I still ate out several times a week, but I stopped treating every meal like part of the travel experience. I used less expensive transportation for simple trips and saved private rides for evenings, bad weather, or longer distances. Most importantly, I stopped trying to fill every day. Some mornings I stayed home and did laundry. I watched a movie. I called my daughter. I read on the balcony. I went to the grocery store and came back. That may sound boring. It was exactly what I needed. A place does not become home because every day is exciting. It becomes home when an uneventful day still feels good. During that test month, my spending looked very different. Rent, $610. Electricity, water, and internet, $143. Groceries, $267. Eating out and coffee, $162. Transportation, $109. Travel insurance and medical expenses, $208. Phone, laundry, and household items, $86. My remaining American expenses dropped to $179 after I canceled subscriptions and changed my phone plan. Miscellaneous spending came to $128. The total was $1,892. That left $383 from my monthly income. Not a huge amount, but enough to build a travel fund, replace something that broke, or cover a more expensive month. I also still had my savings. I did not want to use those for ordinary bills, but knowing they were there gave me security. This was the first budget that felt honest, not a fantasy about living for $1,000, not an inflated tourist month, just a normal, comfortable routine that fit my income. And something else happened during those weeks. The woman who had spoken to me during my first stay messaged to ask whether I had returned. We met for lunch. She introduced me to a few other people. One invitation led to another, and soon I had names in my phone that were not connected to apartments, transportation, or reservations. I was beginning to have a life instead of an itinerary. For anyone considering a trip like mine, there are a few things I wish I had understood before leaving. A month in each country was not quite enough. The first week disappeared into recovering from the flight, learning basic routines, and spending extra money because I did not know better yet. 6 weeks would have given me a more honest picture without slowing the trip down too much. I also would not reserve an entire month before arriving. Booking everything in advance gave me peace of mind, but it locked me into short-term prices. A better approach would have been to reserve the first week or two, look around, and then negotiate a longer stay once I understood the area. Another mistake was planning as though retirement had given me unlimited energy. It gave me time. It did not give me a different body. At 67, I could walk around all day and feel fine. What wore me down was repeatedly packing, flying, navigating airports, sleeping badly, and immediately starting over somewhere unfamiliar. Rest days should have been part of the schedule from the beginning. I am also glad I kept emergency money outside my travel budget. I did not need it, but knowing it was available kept every inconvenience from feeling like a crisis. And I would never recommend cutting every connection to the United States immediately. Keep a working phone number. Make sure you can access your bank accounts. Have someone you trust receive important mail. Test how you will verify your identity before trying to log in from another country. Most importantly, do not build your budget around how cheaply somebody else claims to live. A person happy in a small local apartment will spend differently from someone who needs strong air conditioning, reliable internet, private health care, and imported groceries. Neither lifestyle is wrong. The useful question is not, what is the smallest amount anyone can survive on? It is, what does the life I would honestly enjoy cost? For me, that appeared to be somewhere between $1,800 and $2,000 a month in the Philippines. My Social Security could cover that without requiring regular withdrawals from savings. I was not choosing forever. Exchange rates could change, rent could rise, my health might eventually require something different. I was only deciding where I wanted to take the next step. But before I signed anything, there was one conversation I needed to have. The hardest conversation was with my daughter. Not because she wanted me to come home immediately. She had been supportive from the beginning. What worried her was the idea that I might choose a permanent future based on a few good months. We had a long video call, and she asked me questions I had been avoiding. What would I do if I got sick? How often would I return to the United States? Was I planning to buy property? What if I felt lonely 6 months later? Did I have enough money to leave if things did not work out? Those were fair questions. I told her I was not buying anything. I was not making a forever promise. I would keep an emergency fund large enough to fly home and restart if necessary. I would review my budget every 3 months. I would come back to visit, and she could visit me when the timing worked. Then she said something that surprised me. "Mom, you sound more like yourself than you did before you left." That sentence settled something in me. Before retirement, I had become very good at managing my life without really participating in it. I went to work, I paid bills, I handled problems, I waited for weekends, then used weekends to recover from the week. Travel did not magically fix everything. There were lonely days, there were frustrating days. There were moments when I missed my own bed, my daughter's kitchen, and the ease of knowing exactly how everything worked. But I was engaged again. I paid attention to where I was. I learned things. I met people I never would have met at home. I made decisions because I wanted to, not because a schedule had already decided for me. By then, I understood what my spreadsheet could not tell me. I could afford to live in several of the countries I had visited. The harder question was where I could picture building a routine, asking for help when I needed it, and feeling connected to the people around me. For me, that place was the Philippines. So I signed a 6-month lease. The rent was slightly lower than my test apartment because I committed for longer. I bought a few kitchen items, 2 sets of sheets, and a small desk. I did not decorate much. Part of me was still afraid that putting pictures on the wall would make the decision feel too serious. Then I unpacked both suitcases completely. For months, I had kept everything organized for the next departure. Shirts folded so they could go straight back into packing cubes. Toiletries kept in travel bags. Documents always ready. This time, I put clothes into drawers. I placed my daughter's photograph beside the bed. And for the first time since leaving the United States, I stopped checking the calendar for my next flight. It has now been a few weeks since I signed the lease. I do not have a dramatic ending to offer you. I have not purchased a dream home. I have not figured out the rest of my life. I am not waking up every morning feeling fearless and certain. Some days I still wonder whether I should have chosen Thailand because it was so practical. Other days I miss Vietnam's food or the amount of money I was able to save in Cambodia. And then there are mornings here when I walk outside, someone greets me by name, and I feel the answer without needing to explain it. I came to Southeast Asia looking for the cheapest place my retirement check could support. What I found were several countries I could afford, each with different trade-offs. The final decision came down to where I still wanted to be after the excitement of arriving somewhere new had worn off. So this is where I am staying for now. For now might not sound very brave, but those 2 words are honest. I do not know how I will feel after living here for another 6 months, and I do not need to decide the rest of my life today. My daughter asked whether I finally feel retired. I told her retirement is not the word I would use. Retirement sounds like something ended. This feels more like I finally made room for something to begin. I am 67 years old. I have 1 daughter, 1 6-month lease, $2,275 coming in each month, and enough savings to sleep at night. I still write down what I spend. I still compare prices. I still worry sometimes. But I also have plans next week with people who know my name. I have groceries in the kitchen, clothes in the drawers, and no flight booked out. For 20 years, I said I wanted to see the world when the timing was right. The timing was never perfect. I simply reached an age when waiting began to feel riskier than leaving. I had spent months arriving somewhere new, unpacking halfway, and preparing to leave again. Now I was staying long enough to discover what an ordinary life here might become. For once, I am not planning my escape. I am planning my life.